Chapter 4. Paris, France. As he walked the streets, V&H Helsing made sure the mask covering the bottom half of his face was secure. It would not do to attract attention now. That was easy enough this late on a rainy night with few people on the streets. Less than usual, he was certain, because of the recent trouble. His wide-brimmed hat covered much of what his mask did not. Someone would have to get very close to him to see his eyes, and he didn't intend to let that happen. His long and flowing dark cloak hid the shape of his body, completing the disguise. It had the additional advantage of holding all of his field equipment. Paris felt somewhat familiar, as if he had spent considerable time here, but of course he had no memory of ever visiting it before his brief trips over the last few years. He no longer questioned that sort of déjà vu. He was reasonably certain that he himself was not French. Even if there were answers for him in this city, he did not think he would find them tonight. He caught sight of a very large half-built iron tower in the background. "That's new," a voice inside of him said. He knew that voice well. It was that of another life he could not remember, one that taunted him with glimpses of a past unknown. Dancing shadows played across a dog-eared poster slapped on a wall illuminated by gaslight, seeming to animate the heavy black letters that screamed Davis de Recherche. Wanted, and for 2,000 francs, no less. Similar signs peppered the city, and Van Helsing had to admit that the likeness of him was a good one. That captured the French psyche perfectly for him. They got the fine details right, but still managed to entirely miss the most important points. They thought he was the enemy? If they only knew about the real dangers out there, they would drop their baguettes and run for the hills. A high-pitched, blood-curdling scream pierced the night. He hated to admit it, but the Cardinal was right. He had been needed here. Reaching out, he pulled down the poster, crumpling it in his hand. Well, at least the French appreciated his efforts on their behalf. He walked with new purpose, heading for the source of trouble. It did not take long for him to find her. She lay in the great stone courtyard in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. She was dead, no doubt of that. He quickly scanned her broken body to make certain that this was the work of his assignment. On the ground next to her, something small was burning. Reaching down, he picked up a smoldering cigar stub covered with saliva. There it was, a sound, something that didn't belong in this world. His prey was nearby. He quickly searched the cathedral with his eyes. There was enough moonlight that he could trace the individual spires and gables of the great building. He had never been this close to the cathedral before, at least not that he could remember. Notre Dame was beautiful, a tremendous achievement in both design and construction. It had two large bell towers that rose up on each side, flanking a single enormous stained glass window high up near the center of the building. Begun in the 12th century, it was one of the truly magnificent works of man. And now lying dead in front of it was the work of a monster. There, a shadowy figure was scaling the sheer wall halfway up the side of the building, and then disappeared over a railing. Van Helsing headed for the front door of the cathedral. Once inside, he started up the stairs. Following his ears, he made his way to the north bell tower. Stepping up into the belfry, he saw a dark and dusty room filled with religious statuary and relics. The past was in here for many, but not for him. Here, all he would find was his assignment. He kept his senses sharp as he passed the massive church bell. Moonlight shone through the windows, but there were many gloomy corners and shadows in the large room. Then he both heard and felt the danger nearby. Van Helsing froze, every part of him poised and ready. The very large figure dropped in front of him, hanging upside down from the rafters, snarling gutturally. The muscular creature was at least 9 feet tall and looked like a man with all of his finer qualities removed, his hair matted, his brow exaggerated, his skin hairy, sallow, and rough, the large jowls with graying mutton chops and the mouth that dripped saliva. Mr. Hyde wore no clothing save a pair of torn trousers. The monster would have looked completely animal-like but from the burning cigar clamped between his rotting teeth, the smell of which did little to hide the stench of death and decay that emanated from him. Hyde's malice was as palpable as a chill. Van Helsing had no doubt that he was looking into the face of evil, not the theoretical evil of religious discussion, but the reality of it. An evil that took life for pleasure, for sport, its most recent victim lying on the pavement outside. An evil that would kill with as little hesitation as a normal man would have a meal. In fact, Mr. Hyde would likely combine the two activities if he could. Van Helsing took a step back. "Evening," he said, keeping his voice neutral. The creature looked him over and answered in a rough growl, "You're a big one. You'll be hard to digest." "I'd hate to be such a nuisance." He was surprised at the creature's attempt at humor. Mr. Hyde had once been Dr. Jekyll, a renowned physician. How much of the doctor survived inside that corrupt form? He immediately pushed the thought aside. It merely made his work harder, and he could not afford distraction. Hyde somersaulted down and nimbly landed on his gnarled feet. Van Helsing looked him over, reminding himself not to underestimate him as a foe. "I missed you in London," Van Helsing remarked. Hyde gave him an unpleasant smile and said, "No, you didn't." He lifted up his huge arm to show 3 cauterized bullet holes that Van Helsing had blown straight through the creature's biceps. "You got me good," Hyde seethed, circling him, looking more predator than man. Van Helsing matched his movements. There was a single formality to be performed before he finished the job begun in London. "Dr. Jekyll, you are wanted by the Knights of the Holy Order." "It's Mr. Hyde now." He ignored the interruption. Though he doubted there was anything left of the doctor in the thing in front of him, whatever was still Jekyll deserved to hear the charges against him. For the murder of 12 men, 6 women. Hyde smiled again and finished, 4 children, 3 goats, and a rather nasty massacre of poultry. The monster sized him up before declaring, "So you're the great Van Helsing." Hyde blew a large smoke ring in his direction, as if to taunt him. He ignored it. "You are a deranged psychopath." As if to prove Van Helsing's statement correct, Hyde took his hot cigar out of his mouth and crushed the glowing end on his palm. Van Helsing winced inside but kept his expression steady. Hyde didn't even flinch. "We all have our little problems," the creature opined. It was time. Soon all pretense would fall away and this matter would be settled. There was a rhythm to these encounters, and Van Helsing recognized the signs. He readied his body and his mind, calling on all of his training and his instincts. "My superiors would like for me to take you alive, so that they may extricate your better half." "They would they?" Hyde snarled back. "Personally, I'd rather just kill you and call it a day." That much was true. He didn't see any hope for Dr. Jekyll. "Let's make it your decision, shall we?" Hyde just laughed. When the creature moved, it was quick and sudden. He lashed out with one of his oversized hands, catching his nemesis in the face and slamming him back into the wall behind him. Van Helsing calmly wiped the blood off of his mouth. "Good. We're in agreement, then." Taking a creature like Mr. Hyde in was much riskier than simply killing him. There was too great a danger of him escaping to murder again. And then there was the problem of extricating Jekyll from this monster. For the people who did that work, the process was at least as hazardous as Van Helsing's own. Still, the Cardinal had insisted that he make the attempt to reach the doctor and give him the chance. Van Helsing had done that much. Now it was time to do his work, to collect this trash. In one swift movement he reached into his cape, drawing the revolvers holstered on each hip. The reports thundered in the bell tower as the powerful weapons jumped in his hands. He stood his ground, waiting for the smoke from the pistols to clear. When it did, Hyde was not there. Well, he was almost supernaturally fast. Van Helsing holstered his guns, anticipating the enemy's next move. Hyde suddenly charged at him out of the shadows. Reaching into his cloak again, Van Helsing grasped the circular blades decorated with Chinese inscriptions, one of the Vatican's newer inventions. Stepping out of Hyde's way, he pivoted on his feet and lashed out with the blades, cutting the creature across the ribs as he passed. Howling in pain, Hyde continued forward several steps until he crashed into the huge church bell, which clanged loudly from the impact. Hyde managed to stay on his feet, holding his ears and screaming out, "The bell! The bell!" Van Helsing started to spin the spring-loaded blades in his hands. They turned quickly against their handles, building up more and more speed until they were just blurs. Hyde's eyes focused on the blades. In response, he grabbed the enormous bell with both hands, tearing it from its yoke in a feat of incredible strength even for something his size. Before Van Helsing could move, he saw the bell coming toward him. That was it, his final miscalculation. Van Helsing had skills and training that made him a match for anyone of this world and many who belonged in the next. But he was only flesh and blood. As the bell came down on him, he would be instantly crushed. At least it would be quick. And then everything went dark, though the killing blow never came. Suddenly he realized why Hyde had used the bell to trap him instead. The creature was toying with Van Helsing, like a cat playing with a helpless mouse. Hyde laughed at his own cleverness. The esteemed Van Helsing was now trapped like a bug in a jar. For all of his reputation, he had been relatively easy prey. Not much harder than all the others. Hyde's next meal would indeed be savored like no other before it. A muted buzzing came from inside the bell, the unmistakable sound of wood being sawed through. The monster's grin faded and was replaced with pure rage at this latest trickery. Van Helsing would never escape. Reaching out with his gigantic arms, Hyde hoisted the tremendously heavy bell over his head, a feat not lost on someone who would have had difficulty even ringing it in his previous incarnation. As that weakling Jekyll. He reveled in his strength and power, even as he spied the circular hole that his nemesis had cut into the floor. Gone. The buzzing sound came again, but this time from above. Caught by surprise, Hyde instinctively looked up. Van Helsing was waiting inside the bell, a smile on the hateful man's face. Before the monster could even react, Van Helsing slashed downward. The circular blade met Hyde's raised left arm, and a second later the severed limb was on the floor, flailing for a few moments, as if unwilling to accept its fate. Howling in pain, Hyde dropped the bell with a crash, splintering the wood floor as Van Helsing rolled free of his temporary prison. "I'll bet that was upsetting," Van Helsing remarked. "This won't take long now," he thought, preparing to jump down and end this battle, but something caught his attention. The severed arm stopped moving, as if the life and malice inside had vanished. In front of Van Helsing's eyes, it transformed from the powerful limb of an evil monster into the thin, spindly arm of a harmless old man. He was frozen by the sight. Perhaps the doctor was in there somewhere, too overwhelmed by the malicious power of Hyde to break free. The creature made the most of Van Helsing's moment of distraction and with a fierce lunge, grabbed him with its remaining arm, throwing him straight up. Van Helsing felt himself flying toward the ceiling and then crashing through it. The cool night air assaulted his senses as he came down onto the deck, a cloud of unconsciousness looming and threatening to overwhelm him. Shaking his head, he tried to get up. He had to. Hyde was nearby, he could sense it. Too late. Van Helsing was yanked up by the back of his collar. He shook his head again and breathed deeply, feeling the chill reviving him. "I think you'll find the view up here rather spectacular," he heard the creature laugh. They were at the edge of the tower, and Hyde lifted him so that they were face to face. Van Helsing could smell the stink of the monster's last meal on his breath. It reeked of rotting flesh. Van Helsing decided not to speculate on what Hyde had eaten. The abomination smiled at him, and Van Helsing searched his face for any sign of humanity. He saw none. "Been a pleasure knowing you," Hyde reflected, and Van Helsing was cast into open space, hurtling toward the ground below. Completely alert and without even thinking, he drew the grappling gun holstered at his side, aimed, and fired. The hook shot out, its tether trailing behind it. Van Helsing sensed the earth rushing up beneath him and knew that it would be close, very close. The grappling hook blew right through Hyde's stomach. He fell back, out of Van Helsing's sight, and the hook's line went taut. Van Helsing held on to the gun with both hands and felt himself snap to a halt. Looking down for the first time, he realized that he was hanging just 2 feet above the cobblestones. The line suddenly went slack, and Van Helsing crumpled to the ground. Looking up, he saw that the creature was teetering on a ledge, barely keeping himself from falling over. The grappling line had gone straight through him, and the barbed steel on the end of the hook would make certain that it did not come out easily. Getting to his feet, Van Helsing grabbed the tether and gave it a quick, solid yank. He watched as Hyde tipped forward. The monster immediately pinwheeled backward with his single arm, and then with all of his might threw himself out of view. Still holding on to his grappling gun, Van Helsing was pulled up off the ground. There was a distant crash. Hyde had plummeted through the roof of the church. Before he could let go of the gun, Van Helsing flew toward the top of the tower as Hyde fell. On his way up, he witnessed the monster smashing through the great stained glass window of Notre Dame, which exploded outward, a deadly hailstorm of multicolored shards raining down on the courtyard. Miraculously, Van Helsing landed a moment later, hard but on his feet, at the top of the tower. Peering over the edge, he saw the last seconds of Hyde's descent. The creature seemed to ripple and shrink as he struck the cobblestones. Mr. Hyde was dead. And he had died a man, not a monster. Van Helsing had been very lucky more than once during the course of this encounter, but he felt neither victorious nor fortunate. Instead, a hollow sadness opened up within him. The fact that the monster was dead gave him no comfort. The man, Dr. Jekyll, had been in there all along. Had the doctor fought against the darkness of Mr. Hyde? From what Van Helsing knew of the case, the doctor created the formula that had transformed him as part of his medical research. He had used it on himself, once and then again, with greater and greater frequency, until there was no turning back. How had it felt for Jekyll to lose his humanity, step by step, dose by dose, until there was no man left at all, just a monster? Did he know what was happening at the beginning of his journey? How had he felt when he took those first steps toward the abyss? Van Helsing was afraid that he already knew the answer. He made the sign of the cross. God rest your soul. People were gathering, pointing up at him. Van Helsing! It's Van Helsing. Someone in the small crowd called out. He recognized the sergeant of the gendarmes, who raised an angry fist and screamed in French, "Van Helsing, you murderer!" Other figures were running to the scene and would be coming up the stairs. He turned round and headed for the rear of the tower. He could be on the ground in seconds with his grappling hook, but it was gone now, buried inside the belly of a dead old man outside. Van Helsing started climbing down and was making his final leap to the street when he heard the first voices from above. Disappearing into the shadows, he soon came face to face with 2 men who had run outside of a pub to see the commotion. Skidding to a stop in front of them, Van Helsing saw the flash of recognition in their eyes. "Vaus!" one of them exclaimed, holding out a finger in accusation. Reflexively, Van Helsing drew a pistol and pointed it at the larger of the 2 men. He wouldn't use it unless he had to, but he had had it with the French today. Without thinking, he cocked the hammer and prepared to shoot. A boy stepped out from behind the man Van Helsing was aiming at. It was obvious that he was the child's father. Time stopped as they looked at Van Helsing. His heart dropped into his stomach and he felt as though he were teetering on the edge of a precipice. As quickly as he could, he uncocked and holstered the weapon. Turning away, Van Helsing made his way down the narrow lane toward his horse, taking measures to ensure that anyone following him would lose the trail. He knew he didn't need to worry that the 2 men and the child had seen him. There had been fear in their eyes.